In God alone do we find rest for our souls. In southern Africa, there is a vast desert, the Kalahari, and there is the last place on earth that elephants make a very, very long journey year after year. It's the last place where they go miles and miles roaming paths that they have trod before. According to the Disney documentary that I watched about them, at least. But the Kalahari, there's a river that empties, one river, into this vast desert. So there is a place that becomes a wetland for a few months every year, and it's a glorious oasis in the desert. All the animals flock there. But then it starts to dry up. And the elephants, in their intelligence and remembrance of how to survive, they know when it is drying up and they begin their journey. They go 1,000 miles round trip, a journey that could take 8, 9, 10 months, almost the whole year, but their survival depends on it. They go from place to place, from water hole in the desert to the next water hole. And the documentary that I watched showed a matriarch, her name was Gaia, who had taken that journey 50 times in her life. And what they say about elephants remembering is true, because she remembers the journey from each year, and that is how she guides her family to safety, because a wrong choice, a wrong direction could mean their death. When water is so scarce, you have to be certain that there will be water soon. Elephants also apparently can sense water. With their feet, they feel communication in the ground from each other, but also they just have this sense in a way about where water is, how deep it is in the ground, how far they need to go to get it. It's pretty amazing. And aerial views in this documentary showed in the desert these little circles, which are the water holes, and you can see the paths from them walked year over year by the elephants. Those are the paths that lead to life for them, paths that they must and do depend on from their wisdom and their experience. How neat, I think, that they have walked those paths so many times that we can see them. Those are the paths that lead to water, paths to life and deep rest. The psalmist today in Psalm 62 also knows God's deep rest, God's love. Psalmist, of course, is not an elephant, does not need to walk through the desert in order to have water, but the psalmist knows that God is the path to life, that if there is a path to be trod, it is the path to God and God's steadfast love. This psalm exudes faith and confidence in God. We sometimes think of faith as a set of beliefs that we ascribe to, that we choose. We think faith sometimes is all in our heads, but this psalmist knows that faith is about one's very life, one's very being. It is trust in the living God. And the psalmist places that trust in God, not out of naivety, but because the psalmist knows God's love, has experienced God's love, and has reason to trust. The psalmist is so confident in God because the psalmist has known other ways. Perhaps not ways or paths that they've chosen in their own life, but they've been on the receiving end of paths that are not life-giving. The beginning of the psalm, the part we didn't read, speaks of people attacking the psalmist, of feeling like people have torn them down like a leaning wall or a broken fence. The psalmist speaks of people who bring others low by deceiving them and cursing them. And of course, in the part that we heard today, we heard about money and humans trusting and turning to riches or wealth. But the psalmist knows those are not ways that lead to God's abundant life. The psalmist knows God's deep rest because the psalmist has experienced God's trustworthy love, because everything else, everything that we seek after that is not God is a vanity, in the words of Ecclesiastes. It is like breath, the psalmist says. We turn to all kinds of other things. We choose all kinds of other paths that don't lead to God's life-giving water. We turn, as the psalmist has mentioned, to violence, to money, to power or privilege or achievement. And even if we think that we are good and don't rely on these things, my own experience has shown me that there are very sneaky ways that we come to rely on other things that are not God. Things that will wind us up not at water, but at an empty hole in the desert where we will be thirsty. Sure, power, money, and privilege will quench our thirst for a while, or we will think that they do, but eventually it runs out. Our ways are often ways of sin. We think of sin often as something, again, that we choose, an individual act or something that is done, but the Bible and traditionally in our faith, we think more broadly of sin as our whole being. It is our condition. It is the way that we are oriented away from God and love and neighbor and towards violence, destruction, towards selfish ambition. So when we are baptized, we ask people to turn away from sin and turn towards Jesus Christ. Sin, again, being this condition of our hearts that will never go away, but that our lifelong journey through God's love and grace is to continually turn back to God. There is a scene in this documentary about the elephants where they look into Gaia, the matriarch's eyes, and they sort of flash forward through the whole journey that will be ahead. But at the end, there is safety and there's life for her family. And so with each of our decisions, each of our days, what is the flash forward of the decisions that we are making, of the things that we are doing? Are they leading towards God's abundant life, toward a water hole filled with God's life-giving water? Or will the eventual outcome of what we are doing lead to us thirsty, dry, and dying in the desert. God desires that we have life, that we know the rest that this psalmist speaks so confidently of. So what are we choosing? What path are we on? Each day is an opportunity to assess and to look to God for direction. How do we trust in God like this psalmist? How do we find that true rest? We can't see God in the flesh, but we know the ways of God, of love, of justice, of peace. And so, like our baptism liturgy guides us, the call each day, I think, is to turn away from sin, from violence, from destruction, from the things that vie for our attention and our heart, and to turn towards God, to walk towards water, to turn again and again to that which is trustworthy and true, and to rest in it. And the more that we rest in it and remember it, the more times we walk that path toward water, the more we will remember and know the way. It's not always easy to do. The confidence that this psalmist has doesn't always come naturally, but it is a choice that we make with God's help, how we will spend our days and our lives. Working for things that are more substantial than wealth or achievement or riches, but for God's own kingdom, which is the only place where we will find refuge. The good news is that God is trustworthy, solid, and secure, that underneath the many things this life offers to us to secure our own fate, that though we ultimately cannot secure our own faith, that God offers us living water in the desert. God is our rock and our refuge. God is loving kindness here for us and for the world. So let us turn again and again and find ourselves on the path of life, leading to living water. Amen.